Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Before we begin, we have some very short housekeeping announcements to run you through. On the left-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit your question to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of the audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green resource list widget following the session today. And we would ask that if you could please complete the survey on the left-hand side of your screen. It only takes 1 minute to complete and your feedback is really helpful to us. Finally, an on-demand version of the webcast will be available about 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier on today. Now, I would like to turn over the webinar to Matt Johnson, CEO and co-founder at QCware, to open the discussion. Matt, over to you.
Greetings to everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in today. My name is Matt Johnson. I'm the CEO of QCware. We're a quantum computing software company based in Palo Alto. Before we kick off today, I just want to make two really quick points. First of all, I think a lot of you are aware that QCware organizes the annual Q2B conference, which is held every December in Silicon Valley. This year, by the way, it's going to be from December 7th to the 9th at the Santa Clara Convention Center. Now, one of the comments we've got from many of the attendees is that while they appreciate these annual events, there's such a deluge of information coming at them during the calendar years that they're asking for more Q2B content to be delivered between those events. And to that end, I'm very, very happy to announce that QCware and Informa are joining forces to, in the future, launch more in-person and virtual Q2B events. Informa is a FTSE 100 company that's really the world leader in educating and connecting communities and emerging technologies. And they do that by organizing events, publishing research, and running educational programs. So what we're doing is combining the reach and brand and content of Q2B with the organizational scale of Informa. So please stay tuned to more announcements on that. Now, specifically related to this first webinar, the subject matter is extremely important. The US government has stated at a policy level that maintaining dominance in quantum technologies, including quantum computing, is essential for national competitiveness and national security. Recent announcements out of Chinese research laboratories suggest that the Chinese may have built quantum computers that are at parity with, or perhaps even more powerful than the most powerful quantum computers that have been built so far by groups in the United States. So today's panelists are going to put sunlight on that issue, and I think it's going to be really informative. And this is really the theme of what we're doing at Q2B, trying to introduce important topics and put sunlight on those issues. So let me now turn everything over to Celia Merzbacher, and I hope you have a very enjoyable and informative session today.
Thanks, Matt. And it's great to be with this fantastic panel today to talk about a very timely topic. This is the first in what will be a new series sponsored by Q2B and the Quantum Computing Summit. So welcome to everyone who is able to join us. And as was mentioned, this is going to be archived as well, and you can share it with those who don't join us today. The topic is China ahead in the quantum computing race? This is indeed very timely. There's been news just within the last week or so, and we'll be getting into that with the panelists. In general, quantum computing is getting a lot of attention. It's in the press and the news. And I just pulled a couple of graphics to illustrate using the amount of investment that's flowing into quantum these days as a sort of proxy for that interest level. So if we can go to the first of the 3 slides that I sent to you, thank you. This is a picture from the US government's National Quantum Initiative program. They report each year their spending and their projected spending. So this is reporting the amount that was spent in 2019, estimated for 2020, and proposed in 2021. I won't go into what all of the acronyms stand for. They're sort of explanatory: sensing, computing, networking, fundamental quantum advances and quantum technology. So quantum computing is getting an increasing amount of investment by the US government. It's risen from about 100 million in 2019 to 150 million in 2020 and projected for 2021. So that's the public investment in the US. Next slide, please. This is, in the context of global investment, just a piece of what's going into this area. This is a recently updated assessment or estimate of global spending by government programs around the world. And while it's hard to get real apples and apples comparison, so I wouldn't put too much on the comparison of numbers between countries, because some are spending more on infrastructure and other areas perhaps included in these numbers, and these numbers also in some cases span multiple years. However, they estimate a total effort in 2021 of $22.5 billion. And just to sort of draw your attention to the amount that has been reported by China, or by those who are watching China, that an investment of approximately 10 billion is being made. Now, just a reminder, this is for all areas of quantum, not just quantum computing, but clearly there's global innovation taking place, and that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. The last slide, if you go to the next one, please, shows the private investment, or one snapshot of the private investment. And this was just published this week by PitchBook, and shows the number of deals in the green dots and the number of dollars, the amount being invested by investors, venture and other investors that are known. And you can see for 2021, these are just partial numbers year to date. Over $1 billion has been announced in deals in 2021, and 34 deals. So the number of deals, the amount of them, the size of them is all going up. So with that, we'll turn now to a conversation with our panelists, and I'll just briefly introduce them. I think they're familiar to many of you. Scott Aaronson is the David Bruton Centennial Professor of Computer Science at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the director of the Quantum Information Center there. Prior to joining the University of Texas, he taught for 9 years at MIT. His primary area of interest is theoretical computer science, and his research interests center around the capabilities and limits of quantum computers, as well as computational complexity theory more generally. According to his Wikipedia page, as a child, he spent a year living in Asia, so he has that connection to the East. And he received his PhD in computer science from the University of California at Berkeley, where he studied under the renowned professor Umesh Vazirani. We also have Will Oliver joining us. Dr. Oliver is jointly appointed at Lincoln Laboratory Fellow in the Advanced Technology Division at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. And he's also a professor of electrical engineering and computer science and physics at MIT, where he also serves as the associate director of the MIT Research Laboratory of Electronics. He too has some connection and a longstanding interest in Asia. I noted that he received his BA in Japanese, as well as a BS in electrical engineering from the University of Rochester, and advanced degrees in electrical engineering from MIT and Stanford. And third, we have Elsa Kania. Elsa is an adjunct senior fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Her research focuses on Chinese military strategy, military innovation, and emerging technologies. Her book, Fighting to Innovate, which sounds very interesting and relevant, should be forthcoming in 2022. She has testified before the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. She's a Harvard alum, and fun fact, she was named an official mad scientist by the U.S. Army's Training and Doctrine Command. So with that introduction, I'd like to start the conversation, and I think we'd all like to know more about what the China announcements mean in some understandable terms. We have a diverse audience, and so I'd like to ask both Scott and Will to give us a little bit of insight on what the key claims are in the recent papers. I think there have been 2 or 3 now by the researchers at the USTC in China. So maybe we'll start with you, Scott, and then we'll hear from Will.
Great. Well, thanks. It's good to be here. So the group of USTC in Hefei, China, which is led by Chaoyang Liu and Jianwei Pan, has had, I think, 4 papers reporting 4 different new quantum supremacy claims within the last year. Okay, so, they've clearly been on a bit of a tear lately. So now 2 of these 4 papers concerned superconducting qubits, which is the same architecture that Google used in its original quantum supremacy announcement back in 2019, which was like, a scale that we're talking about, right? So now in December of 2020, USTC reported an experiment with 56 superconducting qubits on a chip. That's, in comparison to 53 that Google used. And they had 20 layers of gates that they applied to these qubits, actually, the same number as Google. And then the fidelity of the circuit, which is a crucial number that I look at, was about 30% of Google's. So not quite as high. It was like 0.00066. Okay, now just last week they reported a new sampling-based quantum supremacy experiment using superconducting qubits. This one had 4 more qubits, so 60 now, and they do 22 or 24 layers of gates, and the circuit fidelity is similar to before. Now the other 2 papers from USTC concern boson sampling, which was the original proposal for sampling-based quantum supremacy by me and my then student, Alex Arkhipov, in 2011. Now, boson sampling does not directly use qubits at all. Instead, it uses photons, which are generated, sent through a network of beam splitters, and then just measured to see where they end up. So in December 2020, USTC reported an experiment with Gaussian boson sampling, which is a variant of boson sampling, with an average of 50 to 70 detected photons. Okay, the previous record, also from USTC, had been like 14 detected photons. Okay, so that was a record, and that was the first claim to get quantum supremacy via optical quantum computing, as opposed to superconducting qubits. But then skeptics, quickly responded over the past 9 months that probably they could spoof these results with a classical computer, and there was a lot of back and forth about that. Now, in June of this year, USTC bumped that up to over 100 detected photons on average, and they say that they've explicitly ruled out classical spoofing strategies like the ones that were used against their first experiment. Okay, so, discussion continues about that. But, I want everyone to be clear that, there is no claim as yet to do a useful quantum computation here, either from Google or from USTC. There's also no claim as yet to have a truly scalable or error-corrected quantum computer, right? None of these experiments are using any error correction. Okay, the claim, in all these cases is to do some contrived benchmark much faster than we know how to do the same thing using a classical computer. Now, even that claim is open to challenge, and people have been challenging it over the last couple of years by designing faster classical spoofing algorithms. But at the same time as people are doing that, the experiments themselves are also extremely rapidly improving. It's clear that USTC is now at the forefront of that, and that, along with Google, they're now sort of one of the 2 groups in the world that are kind of, actively in the lead in these sorts of experiments.
Thank you. Thanks for that summary. Will, do you have anything to add to that from your perspective?
Yeah, well, Scott said it very well. And by the way, thanks, Celia, for inviting me to be here today. It's a pleasure. I think Scott said it very well. And, you know, when Google demonstrated their quantum advantage back in 2019, I think myself and others, you know, conveyed this as similar to the first flight by the Wright brothers. And I think it's a great analogy because, look, that first flight flew maybe 200 feet. I think it went maybe 30 miles per hour, and it didn't herald the widespread adoption of airplanes, right? It still took decades to get to the point where people were using airplanes either for commercial travel or for military uses. And so what this initial demonstration shows is that there is something interesting to do with quantum computing. It can be very powerful. And the follow-up demonstrations by the USTC group have increased, as Scott said, from 53 qubits to 56, and then more recently to 60 qubits in the case of the superconducting computer. And for me, what is very exciting is that what we see here is that as we add 4 qubits each time, that the comparative amount of time it would take to simulate that on a classical computer gets much, much longer, right? And so this is illustrative of the power of a quantum computer. But as Scott said, look, we're not solving useful problems yet, right? This is just indicating that there is something very powerful going on here. And there is a substantial amount of work that still needs to be done to commercialize this technology and to make it useful, just like there was a substantial amount of work that had to be done before airplanes were commercializable. But we look back in history and we say, yeah, the Wright brothers flight, that was the first time it happened. I think we'll look back in history and say that this Google demonstration and these USTC demonstrations are quite substantial.
Thank you. So we sort of have covered, I think, pretty well the comparison between what's been reported and what Google demonstrated in 2019. One sort of aspect of the scientific endeavor is that when you make a publication, others should be able to replicate it. And it's, of course, not everybody has access to the same hardware, but do you see ways by which researchers in other laboratories would be able to verify the claims that have been made? Scott or Will, either or both?
Yeah, no, I think verification is absolutely crucial here, right? And that takes a few different, we could think of 3 different types of verification, right? The first is just taking the raw data from these experiments and, crunching them independently, right? And, verifying that the experiments did the thing that is claimed, right? For that, it's essential that these experiments publish their raw data, that they make it available for download. And I'm happy to say that both Google and USTC have been doing that. And so they've allowed other quantum computing groups, even skeptics of quantum computing, such as Gil Kalai, to download their raw data and do their own crunching with it. And I hope that continues. Okay, now, a second type of verification, and this is really special to quantum supremacy experiments, right? And so I can't emphasize it strongly enough. Okay, you have to, publish, your benchmark to enable skeptics to see if they could reproduce the results with a classical computer, right? And do it faster than you did it with the quantum computer. Okay, because quantum supremacy is all about, outperforming a classical computer, right? It's right there in the name, right? And so that means that you're fundamentally making a negative claim, right? You're saying no one will be able to match these results using a classical computer. Now that's a claim that is then open to being falsified by anyone with, enough classical computing cycles or a good enough algorithmic idea or both. Okay, and so that give and take has to happen. You have to tell classical skeptics exactly what calculation they would have to do to reproduce what the quantum computer did, right? Which means without knowing anything more about the details of your physical device, just here is what calculation you have to do, right? Here's a mathematical description of what you need to calculate. And then you need to sort of throw everything open to them. Just like in applied cryptography, when someone proposes a new crypto system, they have to publish all the details and they have to enable anyone else to try to break their system, right? That's the only way that we get confidence that crypto systems are secure. It's the same here. So that's an extremely important form of verification, which is has been happening over the past couple of years. And I should say that as the experiments have been making progress, the classical spoofers have also been making progress, right? And so the goal for these experiments, I would say, is to stay ahead of the classical spoofers. Hopefully, eventually, you pull so far ahead that there's not even a competition anymore. Okay, but we want to sort of stay ahead of what a classical computer can do. And so one way to do that is to increase the number of qubits or the number of photons, in your system. And I would say that China is now ahead of Google on that metric, right? In terms of the dimensionality of the quantum states that they are dealing with. They have now pulled ahead of Google. Okay, but then the second metric is the fidelity, right? The accuracy of the experiment, right? The lower the accuracy, the more we're worried that there could be a fast classical algorithm that will reproduce the results. And Google is still ahead on that metric of fidelity. And to me, I think improving the fidelity of the experiments is maybe the most urgent thing right now, if you want to stay ahead of classical spoofing. Now, the third type of verification that you could talk about would be just doing the experiment all over again, right? Someone else doing another quantum supremacy experiment and showing that they can reproduce the same results. Now, you can think of what USTC has been doing as itself a form of replication of what Google did in 2019, right? But I think quantum supremacy is a big enough deal that I would like to see more replications, right? And what about in other platforms like trapped ions, like neutral atoms, right? What about IBM? What about IonQ? What about all the other players? I think they could get into this game as well. And, we would like to see, sampling-based quantum supremacy as a sort of robustly reproducible phenomenon.
Thank you. Will, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I agree with everything that Scott said. And, hats off to both Google and USTC for making all of their data publicly available. So as Scott said, that both the advocates, and the skeptics can investigate and thoroughly vet these results, because that's really at the heart of the scientific process if we're going to validate these results. I guess another point to make here is, well, 2 points. One is that, we talk about quantum supremacy, but it's really a gray area, particularly right now, as these computing systems or sampling systems are just standing up. And so, maybe a better word would be to say quantum advantage at this point, because, as Scott said, somebody may spoof this algorithm, either today or in the coming years. And does that mean that the quantum system didn't demonstrate advantage? And from my perspective, these have already demonstrated substantial quantum advantage, because what we're doing is we're comparing a 53 to 60 qubit quantum system to basically the number one supercomputer in the world, Summit, which, as you may know, has 40,000 processors, each with billions of transistors And if you use the entire computer, it takes hundreds of megawatts of power to run, whereas the cryocoolers for our superconducting experiments is maybe 50 to 100 kilowatts in total, right? And that includes the electronics. So, and we're talking about simulating or sampling solutions in a few hundred seconds to maybe an hour on the quantum computer, and doing the equivalent on Summit would take days to years or more, right? And so to me, even if we come up with a better classical algorithm, we have to compare that against all of these other metrics which matter, which is, power per operation, or energy per op, as it's called, and similar metrics, right? So that's one point. The second thing I'd like to say is I agree 100% with Scott that, what's most important at this point is not just increasing the number of qubits we have. What's very important is improving the fidelity of these qubits. It, of course, is very exciting, as I said, to go to 53, to 56, to 60, and to see how the classical computing resources scale to achieve the same computation. That's quite interesting. But if we really want to realize the promise of quantum computing in the future, we know that we're going to need better fidelity qubits, better fidelity operations, and ultimately error mitigation and error correction. This is a direction we need to go. So it's interesting, of course, to just show what we can do today with the qubits we have, but we're really at the beginning of a very long marathon, and to really realize this promise, we need to make much better qubits.
Thank you. We could go on talking about the technology for the full hour, but I'd like to bring in Elsa now and get her thoughts on, I guess, more sort of tactics and strategy, thinking about the competitiveness issues, signals that might be coming from China in quantum and other areas that indicate their approach to emerging technologies that everyone agrees have both economic and national security implications and value. From your experience and knowledge and view of things globally, what are your sort of insights on how the U.S. should be thinking about China and its interests, especially related to quantum and quantum computing?
Well, first, thank you. I'm happy and honored to be joining the conversation. And as a political scientist and someone more distant from some of the technical dimensions of this, I always find it fascinating, given the intersection of cutting-edge science with potential strategic consequence in this arena. And I would say to start that I think with these advances in quantum science and especially quantum computing, the United States is really facing a reckoning that the technological supremacy that was once taken for granted, especially in Washington, D.C., is now facing perhaps unprecedented challenges. And this has, I think there is much greater recognition of this reality now than there was even a year or a couple of years ago, when the narrative used to be that China couldn't innovate, and there was immense skepticism about whether China truly could be a contender at the cutting edge of some of these new frontiers. And I think, frankly, even the assessments and conventional wisdoms have evolved dramatically within the past couple of months or couple of years, as we've seen this progress, as you've heard discussed in quantum computing in particular. Previously, the perception or assessment was often that, yes, China had a very robust foundation of research in quantum science, especially quantum communications, with some of the work that Pan Jianwei and his team had done with QKD and building up a national architecture and infrastructure around it. But the belief was that China still lagged behind, perhaps by years, in quantum computing, and that there still was some time before we'd see Chinese universities or enterprises going head-to-head with the likes of Google on these types of demonstrations. Instead, it's the gap appears to have been closer to months rather than years, and I think that again should perhaps provoke a reassessment of again some of the skepticism that China can't compete or can't innovate. Though of course the sort of one of the ironies is always, as there's been this drive, especially under Xi Jinping's leadership, to prioritize advances in strategic technologies. There's also been a closing of the openness that had allowed Chinese scientists to engage with the international scientific community, as well as the ongoing crackdown on technology companies that have been at the forefront of these efforts as well. So I think will continue to be fascinating to watch the intersection of strategy and technology on these fronts, especially considering the prominence of quantum technology and the prestige that some of these breakthroughs have conveyed. And I think it's notable that in Xi Jinping's tenure, of the Politburo study sessions that he has convened, only 3 have been on particular technologies, and one of those was on quantum science and computing, which he highlighted was of great significance and strategic value. And I think there is increasingly a recognition by Chinese leaders and Chinese scientists that whereas there was a generation gap and a significant disparity between, for instance, in previous generations of technologies, China's efforts relative to the rest of the world, at this new frontier, there is less of a gap. And as we're seeing, Chinese scientists and companies are starting much closer to the same point as their counterparts in the United States and around the world. So I think certainly we are seeing really change in the game here, and a willingness by the Chinese government to dedicate significant investments to these as priority mega projects under the 14th Five-Year Plan.
Thank you. I think this leads to a question about where the innovation is happening. These publications came out of a university laboratory, presumably funded by the government, but so are our universities, of course. And there was a question in the Q&A regarding the advances and activity, I guess, and leadership on the academic side versus in their businesses, in their industry labs. I was sort of remiss in not including reference in my opening remarks to all that's going on in U.S. companies. Of course, we have not only Google and IBM, but Rigetti, IonQ, Honeywell, and many others. And if we have time, maybe we'll get into the question about these different approaches to quantum computing. But the question I have is how strong is China in academic versus sort of the innovation on the industry side, and what are the indicators of that? Elsa, maybe you go first, and then I don't know if Scott or Will have any insights to add.
Sure. So I guess I'd characterize it more as a dynamic ecosystem in which there's a degree of integration between academic and commercial endeavors. So I think certainly USTC has really been a center of gravity and center of excellence for quantum science in China, and Pan Jianwei has clearly recruited and constructed a very, very strong team and brought in scientists with experience in some of the leading universities and laboratories around the world. And I think certainly the momentum that this team is achieving will likely continue to attract talent, as will the development of a national laboratory dedicated to quantum science within China, as well as a couple of other major key laboratories and national initiatives that are trying to provide the resources and allow for integration across disciplines. So I think certainly a lot of this has started within academia, but the growing attention and efforts by China's leading technology companies, including Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Huawei, have started to gain traction, as well as each of these major companies have set up their own initiatives, started to recruit scientists, and promised to dedicate funding here as well. I think the entrance of the new startups like Origin Quantum and SpinQ into the space is more of a recent phenomenon. A lot of these startups are quite nascent, or were stood up in 2019, 2020, and often sort of spun off from research within universities or laboratories, such as through initial efforts supported by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And I think this also speaks to the fact that the way this ecosystem is evolving challenges some of the prior notions that China had a more of a state-driven, traditional industrial policy-centered approach to innovation. That certainly we do see a prioritization of quantum science and technology at the highest levels, up to and including Xi Jinping himself. And then, but beyond the state funding and support, there's also a growing dedication of investment, including a number of angel investors and new venture capital initiatives that are directing funding to some of these emerging industries. And there's an effort to start to spin off academic research to new startups. And I think this really speaks to as well the focus within Chinese S&T policy on quantum as an industry that could provide important economic dividends and trying to build more connectivity between academic research and starting to have some options for commercial applications, whether that is some, at least initial access to cloud-based quantum computing that I believe Alibaba has been working on, and some of the startups promising sort of cheaper or more accessible quantum computers or analogous capabilities down the road. So there's a lot of plans, a lot of momentum. But definitely, I'll definitely defer to the scientists and those with more technical expertise than I on sort of how to evaluate. But I'd say sort of the focus on integration and trying to build an ecosystem are the features that I see most prominent at this point.
Thanks. I guess rather than answer the same question, I'd be interested in, from the more academic perspectives that Scott and Will have, are you seeing any sort of trends in terms of engagement, flow of talent, students coming to the U.S.? There's a sort of a sense that perhaps students have more opportunities in China than they used to, and that the U.S. is perceived as less welcoming. Are you seeing any evidence of that in your institutions, which are, of course, among the top schools in the country?
I mean, I continue to see many great students and postdocs from China wanting to come here. I see them having a lot of problems getting visas, and I think quantum computing has become somewhat of a restricted area in the U.S. now, right? So they know that they can't say that they want to do quantum computing, if they come here. My personal view is that that's a very, short-sighted and kind of self-destructive policy on the part of the U.S. I think that the way that we win, is precisely by being open, by being able to recruit the best people from wherever they are in the world. That's a major structural advantage that we've always had that, that other countries would have a hard time to recreate. But I've continued to see, many, great as researchers from China wanting to come here. Some of them then go back to China. Others don't. There's, I know of some cases of, Western researchers who have relocated to China, not that many.
Yeah, I would say that I observed the same at MIT, that really we have, large numbers of people who want to study or do research at MIT, and I haven't personally seen a reduction in those numbers. I do know of a few cases of Westerners going to China to work, but I think if you look at the author lists of publications, for example, you will find far fewer Western names on those publications than do you find, Chinese names on publications from the Western nations. I think that reflects the fact that there's still many, many students who want to study in the West. It's very early in the technology. Of course, there is the potential that this technology holds, and so there is a balance, I think, that needs to be struck. But if we think about the various avenues that we have to do research in the U.S. and worldwide, for that matter, is that we do have, of course, academia. There's three tracks, right? We have academia, we have national labs, and we have industry. And I think I agree with Scott that, to the extent that we can maintain an openness on the academic side, it is to our advantage. Clearly, at the national labs, we have the ability to maintain research that's not for publication. And industry, of course, they're going to, of course, publish things that they want to publicize, but they withhold a lot, right, for competitive advantage. And so there are mechanisms in place to maintain some control over the technology, but it would be, in my opinion, a mistake to extend that down to the academic level. It's still, in many cases, pre-competitive, and there's a lot to learn, and we should do that.
Great, thank you. I'd like to draw on some of the questions that are coming from the folks who are in the audience. A lot of good questions. One person is asking, we've been focusing on this recent announcement. It's based on superconducting qubits. However, as I mentioned, there are other technologies, and Scott mentioned photon-based systems or research on photon-based systems. Are you all hearing anything about efforts going on, either academics or in corporate labs, using other platforms, trapped ions in particular, for instance?
Well, sure. I mean, Ion, a startup company that's specifically for trapped ions. Honeywell also has a big group doing trapped ions in Colorado. Those are the two main trapped ion groups that I know of. If there are trapped ion efforts in China, I don't know about them. Then again, a year ago, I didn't know that they were really doing much with superconducting qubits, and clearly they were. So, and then other approaches, Microsoft has famously placed this huge gamble on topological qubits, right? Which, some people think could be, ultimately the best way to scale, but which requires creating a new state of matter that's never been seen in nature, and they've been struggling to get even one qubit to work that way. And then, there are other approaches like neutral atoms, which Misha Lukin's group at Harvard has been at the forefront of.
Great,
yeah, and I would just add that I believe Origin Quantum has worked on qubits based on silicon dot technology, though I'll defer to others, or at least I've seen that reported. I'll defer to others on sort of how that fits into the process. And I believe SpinQ is looking at using nuclear magnetic resonance as a means of developing qubits. So I expect we'll continue to see a greater diversity of techniques coming out of China, some perhaps more viable and useful than others. And I think this does speak to the fact that for all that there's often a framing, especially in headlines these days, of a race for quantum computing, it is, as we've discussed, more of a marathon, and it's a marathon with multiple different courses, and perhaps no single destination. And I think perhaps some dark horses in the race as to which techniques or which companies or which new entrants may be exploring different approaches. I know there's also a lot of attention in China to quantum artificial intelligence, and whether that's machine learning to enhance automation in the process of experiments and development of quantum computers, or the hope that eventually we'll have quantum computers more capable of increasing the power behind algorithms. So it definitely seems to be a lot of options in the works, and will be fascinating to see where all of this goes.
I guess another dimension that we haven't touched on really very much is hardware versus software. I think it's sort of interesting that in this area there is parallel research going on, and that by using classical computing to simulate quantum computers, or sort of basic quantum computers, it's possible to do rather sophisticated software development for quantum computers at this time as the hardware is being developed. I'd be interested in any insights that the panelists might have on software work going on in China. We have Matt Johnson from QCware hosting today's event, and others in the US that are well known, like Zapata Computing and Quantum Computing Inc. and others that are working on the software side. Is that the case in China as well?
I mean, I would think that the U.S. Remains well in the lead on the theoretical side of quantum computing. I mean, on the algorithm side, what I would look at especially is the group of Andrew Yao. So Andrew Yao is a famous computer scientist, a Turing Award winner, who was at Princeton for many years. He then returned to China a couple years ago to start a group in Beijing, which I understand was lavishly supported by the Chinese government, and had personal interest from Hu Jintao, and and his goal was to start sort of an elite theoretical computer science research group in China, and so that that group has really put China on the map in a new way in theoretical computer science. Having said that, it is still the case that the best students from that group, tend to come to the U.S. for graduate study or for postdocs or whatever. So, I think that it is worth watching to see what happens. But on the theoretical side of quantum computing, right? I think the U.S. Retains the ability, if we use it, to recruit the best people from China to come here.
Just add that I think we are seeing sort of more and more Chinese companies and universities move towards more of a full stack approach in their research, or at least in their planning. Huawei, for instance, has expanded some of their research on quantum algorithms. Origin Quantum as well has tried to sort of expand their efforts beyond some of the hardware, also with a focus on chips, on writing and testing relevant software. So I think we will continue to see diversification of the efforts in China, given the funding and talent and drive behind these efforts. And I think given how closely we've seen the gap appear to close in quantum computing itself, I wouldn't be surprised, or I think we can't assume that we won't see comparable progress in some of these other dimensions as well. And I think from a policy perspective, it does highlight the fact that we are in a world where trying to control the diffusion of technology is not going to be as feasible as it was for technologies and capabilities of the past. And I would echo the points that Will and Scott have raised on the importance of openness, that America's advantage is academic freedom and the capacity to attract students and scientists from around the world. And I think when we start to talk about policy and questions of comparative advantage for the future, I think sustaining that openness while continuing to think about more reasonable precautions for research security and integrity, and of having a appropriate balance between the two will be really critical. And I think, frankly, for all of the anxiety in DC, especially about PRC talent plans and recruitment, being able to offer a visa and a green card is the most effective countermeasure that the U.S. government has, should we choose to use it, and I hope we will. Because certainly we have a lot playing to our advantage should we continue to welcome and keep the openness that has been such a critical feature of our capacity to lead.
Thank you. I think we would be remiss to have a panel with this esteemed set of thought leaders and not ask the most frequently asked question, what's on sort of top of mind. When am I going to have access to a quantum computer that's going to be good for something really important and practical? And what are the early areas of application that are most likely to be realized that have real value from a business point of view in particular? So I know we don't have a panel full of the business people, but Scott and Will, you're both sort of swimming around in the pool all the time and thinking about this as well. And I think all researchers want to know what is my research ultimately going to be good for. So maybe we'll start with Will on this one. You're a professor of the practice, after all, and an engineer at heart. So I'd be interested in hearing from you.
Yeah, well, I think it's constructive. I mean, it's a great question, and we're all thinking about it. It's instructive to me, anyways, to think back to the history of classical electronic computing. And you could ask, when did we have a classical computer that did what we wanted? And that answer probably spread across a good 20 years. There's no single point in time when we said, aha, that's when it happened. And that's a natural way that technology evolves, right? And I think that we will see that in quantum computing as well. We know that there are two main thrusts today. One is this so-called, noisy intermediate scale quantum, or NISQ quantum. Basically, what can we do with the qubits we have today before we have quantum error correction, right? And there are a lot of people thinking about that. And it's still an open question to my mind if we will find a commercializable algorithm in the NISQ era. I think that that's still an open question. A lot of people are researching it. But that would certainly be a nearer term commercialization or application that we would find. Of course, the other path is towards error-corrected machines. And once we have error-corrected machines, then we will be able to do computations where the period of time that we're running an algorithm can exceed the lifetime of any of the individual components. But again, that's not going to be a step function. It's not the case, in my opinion, that we will demonstrate a logical qubit, a very important demonstration, but that the next day we will then have 1,000 logical qubit machines running algorithms at scale and, that are commercializable. We have to keep in mind that technology evolution takes time. And so it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly when this would happen. But I'm happy to go on the record to say that this technology is going to evolve over the next 10 to 20 years.
The investors would like you to say 5 to 10 to 20 years.
I'm sure they would.
There are a couple of questions coming in along the lines of, does more investment by the government equal advantage in terms of leadership and being ahead in this race? And we're really focusing on China versus the U.S. It's hard to open the aperture and look at the whole wide world, but maybe at another webinar we'll focus on that. But how much money is needed here, and are we not investing enough? And those of you in the academic world have probably a pretty good idea of how difficult it is to get proposals funded. And so I guess I'm interested in hearing whether that's true in this space today, or and you don't want to grow too rapidly. You have to really manage it to a certain extent, I think, to get good outcomes. But how much is the right amount, in your opinion?
Well, I mean,
either one of you. Scott, go ahead.
I mean, one lesson that I've learned, is that it doesn't really work to just funnel all of this money, into quantum computing specifically, while neglecting, the whole range of fundamental science, right, that quantum computing really depends on and grows out of, right? So, if some university has some, tons of funding for quantum computing and, only quantum computing, but in the meantime, the rest of its physics department, the rest of its CS department are mediocre, right? Then people won't want to go there, or they will have trouble recruiting, right? And so I think that, you have to see quantum computing, as continuous with the rest of basic research, right? And understand that it sits on top of that foundation, right? There's a ton of funding right now for quantum computing, specifically, right? In fact, sometimes it feels like there is, there are too many investors chasing too few, good ideas. But at the same time, it is really hard for graduate students to get fellowships, right? And so, all these other things are being neglected.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Go ahead, Elsa.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just that from a policy perspective, that when we think about U.S.-China rivalry as well as the continuing cooperation, I think I think some of this discussion really highlights that this isn't a sort of simple binary. It's not a quantum Cold War. It's not. The U.S. competitiveness going forward will depend upon our capacity to invest in basic research and education nationwide and across universities. And I think for all of the hype and enthusiasm, with good reason, around quantum science, as you've heard, sort of focusing on one industry of the future, does not solve some of the fundamental challenges in ecosystem, and I think including building a pipeline and thinking about STEM education at all levels. So I think there's definitely a sort of strategic challenges that are reflected within the realm of quantum science, but that are more systemic in character and do require more of a national response beyond more funding for quantum and fellowships, education, and trying to really change the culture of STEM going forward as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that obviously research requires money and funding, right? That's a fact of life. But we want to spend that money effectively. And, if we look back at the last 20 years, 25 years, we're at this point today, I think, in part because, the U.S. government funded quantum at an appropriate level and grew it over time to get to the point where we are. And as I mentioned before, there are basically three lanes. There's the academic lane, the national lab lane, and industry. And each of those have a role to play in developing an ecosystem going forward. And, just dumping a bunch of money in all of the sudden is, probably going to make a lot of people quite happy. But on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily build that ecosystem in a way that is sustainable. And I think that is the goal, is to make a sustainable ecosystem that's going to survive over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So we have enough people that can work in this workforce in the future, and we have jobs for them in industry to go into.
Thanks to all of you. I'm going to just take a couple minutes here at the end. There are a number of excellent questions that we're not going to get to. I believe that the questions may be recorded along with this, and it might even be possible for panelists to answer them after the fact. But thank you to everyone for your thoughtful questions and for participating with us today. I didn't tell you much about QEDC. The Quantum Economic Development Consortium that I lead is a consortium of stakeholders that involves all participants in the quantum ecosystem. Today, it's open to US-based organizations. It's going to be expanding to, in a sort of deliberate way, welcome non-US organizations in the future. But our goal is to enable and grow the quantum industry, not just quantum computing, but other areas and applications as well. And many of the questions that were asked are questions that we tackle in QEDC. What are the enabling technologies that need to be developed? What is the talent that needs to be developed? We have definitely got a sort of supply and demand gap today. Eventually, that probably will close. But what can we do to equip people who want to get into this field to be able to do so? And that's at all levels. We just put on archive a paper about the variety of types of jobs that companies are looking to fill and the variety of skills and degrees that go along with those. So there are many opportunities and a lot of different ways to get involved with the quantum computing world as it emerges. And it's a very exciting time. There's a lot going on in companies. And again, you can find information on our website and other places if you're interested in knowing more. And I am sure that those of you who registered to participate will be hearing about future events in this webinar series. I want to thank all of our panelists again, and I should close by saying what I should have said up front, that the opinions that they expressed are their own, but we had a lively discussion, and I hope that it's answered some questions and maybe raised more. So with that, I'd like to close it out for today and wish you all a very good day. Thank you for joining us.